This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Philip probably doesn't need very much introduction. I hope what we're going to do today is try and talk in part about his work in voluntary euthanasia, but also try and show you a little bit about who the man is behind the headlines, because quite often when you do live behind the headlines, you see that what gets reported in the press is not necessarily what you'd want to be saying, and sometimes it's not very nice about what is said about you. So we'll try and work through some of those issues. I've got a very noisy little dog here in the front row. She's objecting, so hopefully she'll just be quiet, Henny. Thank you. Okay, Philip, to open the session, how would you like to die?
Well, it's a good question. Get straight to the issue, I guess. And also, I'd just like to repeat a little bit about the fact that we were pretty sad that Peter Corris isn't here, because it really was, the whole project of writing this biography was really Peter's idea, and I was only too thrilled to have him come along with the idea and be able to participate with him. Otherwise, I'm sure it wouldn't have happened. And he also asked a question something like that when we were talking about this whole project: how would I like to die? And I guess it's not that hard to answer. I'd like to die in my own place, at my own time. In other words, I like to determine the place and the time of my death. Now, I guess many of us would say that would be the way you would feel too, and you don't always get that choice, of course. I mean, some of us may walk straight out into Hickson's Road after this and be hit by a bus, so that would be the wrong time and the wrong place, presumably. But if you're lucky, you can have some say in it. And, of course, if you plan ahead, you can make sure you've got quite a deal of say in it and go down that path. So that's my hope. I want to make sure that I've got that option. I make sure that I've got the means, I've got the method, I've got the ability to take that step when I like.
You write in the book about your love of the Gibson Desert. That
Yes.
seems to play a role in, I'm not sure whether that's actually where you want to die, but it's got some part of the plan.
I guess, look, it is that idea. I've got this idea. I got asked about this recently when I was doing a sort of thing for TEDx in here in Sydney. They asked me about the same thing. What's this idea about dying out in the desert? And I had this kind of vague, somewhat romantic, naive option that the desert would be a good place to just let things disappear. The idea I have, of course, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a God. And the idea of being recycled back into the planet, back into the earth, makes sense. I went out to the Gibson once. I used to work as a ranger. I talk a little bit about that in the book. I spent some years working as a ranger in Central Australia in National Parks and Wildlife. And I used to do trips out there, out to the west of Alice Springs. Not part of the job, but during one piece of time I had, actually when I was trying to get through my medical course, I decided I needed a total break from people and went out there into the Gibson. I wasn't trying to hide, but it just turned out that I didn't see another person for 30 days. It wasn't, as I said, an attempt to be 30 days in the wilderness or 40 days in the wilderness, but it turned out to be a long sojourn without talking to anyone. And it is very calming and, I think, very therapeutic. And, of course, one doesn't get those opportunities a great deal. So when I sense that the time is coming, I think the idea of being able to drive back out there with my own little bottle of Nembutal so I can speed the process up strikes me as being quite a pleasant and reasonable way to end things. But as I said, you've got to be lucky too. It's not just a matter of having the means. It's also a matter of having a lot of luck.
Okay, well, we might move in a little bit more to the present.
Yes.
You've always said you came to voluntary euthanasia not because of a family tragedy, but simply because you said it made a lot of sense and it was a good idea. But there's a little bit more to it than that, because you have a long history of social causes, and this is really probably your just most recent.
Yes, well, I suppose that's true. I have been involved in a lot of issues which I would see issues of natural justice, issues which I become concerned about and then devote quite a lot of time to, and going right back to the anti-Vietnam days or Vietnam War days and the land rights issue with Aboriginal struggles, which of course still go on. But the reason I first went to the Northern Territory back in the 70s and have spent most of my life in the Northern Territory after leaving university was really because of the thought that it would be good to be involved in a cutting-edge social issue, and that was land rights and the involvement, in this case, with the Gurindji people at Wave Hill, Waddy Creek, with Vincent Lingiari, a very important struggle. And just being there and learning from the people that were going through that has a good way of putting a person's ideas and thoughts back into a certain perspective. I saw the tragic circumstances, the impossible health situation of people that were living under, and their willingness to try and get something that they saw as being clearly their right, and that, of course, was access to their own land. And that was important. And there's been some others. There's been problems associated that upset me about foreign military bases. I was upset about issues at the Darwin hospital when I was there about, again, the concerns that we weren't being prepared enough for the visits of nuclear ships into Darwin Harbour. So there's a lot of those issues. But what happened was that while I was in the middle of one of those issues and worrying about nuclear ships turning up in Darwin Harbour, I switched the radio on one morning and I heard that the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory was planning a piece of legislation to allow terminally ill people the lawful option of a legal death. I thought about it for a minute or two and thought, what a good idea, and went back to sleep again. Thought that was really going to be so straightforward, because realistically it was not an issue I'd thought about. I'd come back as a mature age, we say, sort of almost a geriatric medical student. I did my training here at Sydney University when I was in my 30s. And I don't think the E word was ever mentioned here at Sydney University. And right through working in the Darwin Hospital after I left medical school, no one talked about it, and then I heard about it on the radio. And I thought it was common sense, and I suspect most people in this audience think it's common sense. And that's evidenced by the fact that every time people go out in polling organisations and ask the community, if you're suffering, no hope of recovery, should you have access to lawful help to die, you'll get 8 out of 10 people in Australia, any city, will say yes to that. That's a huge majority. So I was one of those people that thought that made sense, went back to sleep, and was really taken aback by the opposition which started up almost immediately, first from my own new profession, that is the medical profession, who came out ranting about the fact that this was going to destroy the doctor-patient relationship. They weren't going to have a bar of it. They were going to basically wreck it. And I was pretty taken aback by that, because I thought the people were clearly in favour, so what the hell is the medical profession trying to dictate to people about something as fundamental as death? We all know what we think about our own deaths. It's not up to going off and seeing a doctor and getting someone's skilled advice about this issue. We know what we think about our own deaths. And I certainly don't think it's the domain of the medical profession to come along and dictate. So I got annoyed about the AMA's attempt to try and wreck that legislation. And of course, as soon as that happened, the church weighed in, the conservative elements, especially the Catholic Church, and saying they weren't going to let it happen either. And it damn near didn't get through. But I became involved politically in the same way as I'd been involved in these other political issues. We got the law through by one vote through that Northern Territory Parliament, and it became the world's first legislation. It's really quite bizarre. Here we had a case where the Northern Territory was leading the world. There's almost now, Northern Territory doesn't lead the world in anything except perhaps going backwards. I mean, it's not known for its progressive legislation on anything, but here it was. And for a whole stack of cutting-edge issues. I mean, it's really interesting. Why did it happen there? Why in the Northern Territory, which is not known for this? And there's several important reasons, which I'll briefly run through, because we thought a lot about it. First of all, there was Marshall Perrin, the leader of the Conservative government, the premier Conservative Party, and he thought it was a good idea. He didn't have anyone snapping at his heels. He wasn't about to be subject to any challenge for leadership. He thought it was a good idea, and he also linked his own retirement to it. He said, look, I want to go off and do something else. I've been Chief Minister for a while. I'm going to retire. And people kind of liked him, and they said, oh, hell, Marshall wants it. Let's give him a going-away present. And so there was a sort of softening of heart because he's going and he wants this, and so what the hell? So that was one issue. The second issue was the Territory has no upper house. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to get legislation through. The only other place in Australia that's in that unique position, of course, is the Queensland State Parliament. The third thing, the Territory is the most secular place in Australia. When the census is done, you'll find that less people tick belief in religions in the Territory than anywhere else. That always helps. That also helps getting this legislation through. But the last point, and this was quite an interesting one, is that the Territory, people in the Territory like to see themselves a little bit different. Now, I've been living there a long time. I went up there just in my 20s after I finished at university.
Are there any Territorians here today?
Well...
No, you can say what you like.
Well, it's interesting because the Territorians like to see themselves as being different and really a bit better than the rest of you lot down here, and a bit tougher. And they like that image, Territory tough. We're special. And that image pervades the society up there. I first became exposed to it when I used to mark exam papers when I was doing my physics PhD back in Adelaide, early days. And we used to mark matriculation papers in physics. It was a sort of a way of making extra money during your research work. And so every November or December, we would get a big pile of papers from matriculation students around the state of South Australia. And I would mark a question and other markers would mark other questions. And that year, one year before I left the university down there, I got to mark the question that came in, estimate the weight of a brick house. You might think that's a bit of a silly matriculation physics question, and I would agree with you. It is a bit of a silly question. It was really an order of magnitude thing, hardly very taxing. Work out the weight of a brick and multiply the number in the house and you've got your answer. But I'd marked about 10,000 of these papers from all over South Australia, and I knew backwards the weight of a brick house. And then finally this bundle of tattered papers came down from Darwin, the last lot, because this public examinations in the Northern Territory were administered through South Australia, and this pile turned up. And it was my last bundle I had to mark before I'd finished this 3 weeks of work. And I remember vividly opening up the first paper and reading it, and it said, who gives a shit, we don't have bricks up here. And I was kind of intrigued and somewhat impressed by this disregard for the sanctity of the public examination process. As I was writing 0 on their answer, this grudging respect came through to me, and I thought a bit more about that. There was several other people with rather similar answers, but a couple of years later when I drove northwards to go there, and I spent a lot of my time up there in the next few years, I saw elements of that, and of course it came up again in the euthanasia issue, because everyone started to say to the Northern Territory government, no one else in the world has ever brought in laws like this. This would be the first of such laws in the world. Do you really want to go there? Are you really in a position to do that? But the Territorian reaction was, who cares? We're special, we're different, we're better, and we'll do it. And I don't think that attitude would have prevailed in another state, where I think that argument that you shouldn't really go out on a limb, given that nowhere else in the world has bothered with this, would have held the same strength as it did in the Territory. And when those arguments came in, it was just pretty well rejected like water off a duck's back by Territorians, and it did, as I said, pass by one vote. So that's probably the reason why this strange law came in. Now, of course, here we are nearly 20 years later, and there are a lot of places. There's Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland. There's 4 states of America where laws are in, but the Territory was first.
Sometimes I think Philip and the Territory go together, and you can understand why he spent most of his life there. You were speaking on ABC radio this morning. You've had a big media day, as you can tell by your hoarse voice.
Yes.
And Bill Shorten was on John Fane's program before you, and John Fane asked Bill what he thought of voluntary euthanasia. What did Bill have to say? Yeah,
I was a little surprised about that. It has been a big media day. Some of you will be aware there's been police raids on a number of people around Australia looking for the euthanasia drug Nembutal that's been brought into the country. There have been 12 of these incidents in the last few weeks. But I was going to be asked about that, but Bill Shorten was being interviewed, and I was surprised. I had no idea, actually, what Bill was going to say. I've never heard him express a view. I did expect it would be somewhat more enlightened, perhaps, than our current Prime Minister's view, but it wasn't. In fact, on this one, they agree. On this one, there will be no disagreement. So I was very surprised, taken aback. He said, no, absolutely against it. John Fane pushed him and said, well, most people would like to see changes to the law. And the Bill said, well, I don't think that we will be going down that path, meaning the Labor Party, but I suspect, given his influence. So it was a bit of a surprise and a little bit disappointing. So politicians, by and large, look, it's the idea of getting laws changed, and I talk a bit about this in the book. See, what I think's happening, I've spent a lot of time since that first legislation in the Northern Territory in 1996 trying to duplicate that law after it was overturned by federal parliament. And there's been something like 18 attempts in the various state parliaments around the nation. 2 of them have been here in the New South Wales Parliament. And they've all failed. All of them have failed. Some close. There was one last year in Tasmania where the Premier really fought for it, Lara Giddington. It still failed. So there's been a lot of failures in legislative process. And so I thought the fact that I was seeing more and more people joining our organisation Exit and saying to me things like, yeah, changing the law would be good, but really, I haven't got time to wait. They're elderly, it's taken 10 years, there's no light on the horizon. What I want is my own drugs. How can I get them? So we spend a lot of time telling people how they can get their own drugs, and I thought what drove that was the feeling of despair over the absolute failure of legislative process. But I think there's something else going on, and I think more I reflect on this, I think what we're seeing now is that there's a cohort of baby boomers reaching their twilight years, getting into this time of their lives when one is forced to think about one's own mortality. And because they're used to an environment where if things don't suit, they would go out and change laws, they're seeing more now, not so much of just taking control themselves. And so this idea that you might have to change the law may not be the answer. In other words, rather than having to go off and present your case cap in hand to a bunch of doctors, which is what legislation always does, if you are terminally ill and satisfy all sorts of tight restrictions, go off and have your case assessed by a panel of doctors, and then if you pass, you get given the drugs. That's the way legislative initiatives always work. But more and more people are turning away from that, and they're saying, I don't want to have to subject my case to that situation. And the way they're doing it then, of course, is to basically be interested in having their own options in their place. And that growth in that number of people, I think, has something to do with this different way of thinking of people that are now reaching in larger and larger numbers their 60s and 70s.
So Mr. Shorten didn't see it as a mandate?
No, Mr. Shorten didn't see it as a mandate. And it is interesting, isn't it? Because you would imagine that, as I said earlier, when we poll this issue, we get 7 out of 10 people say yes to the question. That's a huge level of support for any social issue. And I remember the issue, you'd think politicians would be falling over themselves to support it. I mean, you don't get 7 out of 10 people supporting a particular issue consistently, and you'd expect politicians to take notice, but they resoundingly haven't done it. And the question has to be asked, why doesn't that translate into changes to the law? And I remember one incident up in the Northern Territory when we had our law and it was being challenged by the federal parliament. That was in 97. A bunch of senators came to the Northern Territory to get submissions from the people of the North about why they should leave, that is, the federal parliament should leave this territory law alone. And one interesting example took place on the day we were having public hearings. It was quite packed in the Territory Assembly building, but one person came in sitting up the back, dressed like a real bush. He looked like he'd been riding his horse for 3 days to get there, straight out of the Victoria River region. He walked in and he sat up the back, watched the proceedings for several hours, and then when it finally became his time, he got up and he started to address the panel of about 10 senators. And he said, "What I'd like to say to you, senators," he said, "is that I can't understand why you're trying to take our law away. Because 8 out of 10 of us Territorians, we really, really want this euthanasia law. And I would have thought that 8 out of 10 should have constituted a mandate. I would have thought it's the sort of mandate that ought to give you politicians an orgasm." And they all, Senator Harradine briefly woke up and looked around, but orgasm or not, politicians are not responding to that 8 out of 10 strong support, and including, it would seem now, the leader of our opposition, are not responding to it. They're not reflecting the views of the electorate, and that does beg a big question, which I'm not going to even try and answer today because I could spend the next hours talking about it, is why is it that the political process seems so incapable of dealing with this issue? I mean, it was fascinating before the last federal election, Compass 21 or whatever it was called, the ABC ran around and asked all sorts of questions of people. One of them was on voluntary euthanasia. One of them was on same-sex marriage. The same-sex marriage question came out with about 52% in support, and the voluntary euthanasia question came out with about, as expected, 75 to 80% support. But the next thing I saw, that very night the results were released a week out from the federal election, there's about a dozen microphones shoved into the face of Tony Abbott, saying, what are you going to do about same-sex marriage? 52% of Australians want it. Silence on the fact that 80% of people wanted an answer on the issue of voluntary euthanasia. So I'm not sure why it hasn't happened, and I feel increasingly like that I agree more and more with the idea that the best thing to do is get your own options in place, prepare your own plans, and don't put too much faith in the whole process of legislative change.
Right. You mainly, but both of us, you're the author of the only banned Australian published book in the last 35 years.
Yes, it's quite an achievement.
How do you feel about that?
Especially I like to talk about it, especially at a writers' festival. Thank you. Let me wave the banned book around. A totally banned book. It's a crime to possess. Yes, no, we wrote
and to display. That's $10,000 gone.
So, no, we wrote the book because it became clear that, I mean, people really wanted to know how they could take this step of being able to peacefully end their lives. And so we thought we'd make that information available in an accessible form and put it into a book and called it the Peaceful Pill Handbook and published it. And originally it went for the Office of Film and Literature Classification and received a restricted classification, which we were happy with. In other words, it had to be kept out of sight and sold to people over the age of 18. Restricted classification. But the federal government wasn't happy. And the Federal Attorney General, Philip Ruddock at the time, appealed the decision of the supposedly neutral independent assessment board and had to go back for review, and the review panel refused classification, which has banned the book. And so, as Fiona just said earlier, this is the only book Australian published to be banned in the last 35 years. So it had to be gathered up and taken off the shelves and taken out of sight. It's still available on the internet, but there's been very strong moves to try and restrict that access too. Look, it's a quaint notion, this idea that the way you keep people living longer, healthier lives is to keep them deprived of the information they want about ending their lives, which seems to be the underpinning theory behind the idea of banning. If people don't know about Nembutal, they can't take it. Don't go around, they say, and talk to groups of people about Nembutal because they'll all be out there sourcing bottles of it and swilling it down in Pitt Street and dropping in the gutters. The idea seems to be the only reason any of us are alive is because we can't quite work out how to die. So for God's sake, don't tell them how to die because they'll be out there doing it. So we keep people locked in glass cages. They don't know anything. They smile and live long, long, long into their twilight years. And it's a happy and healthy nation. I think it's ludicrous. This idea of banning is silly. It became stark, actually, not too long ago. I was speaking in Canberra, and a woman came up afterwards, introduced herself as a librarian senior from the Australian National Library on the very imposing building on the shores of Lake Burley Griffith. And she said, what do you, if you've got any time tomorrow, why don't you come across to the library because we've got something that you might find interesting. So I went over there the next day and met the librarian, and she said, come down into the basement. The basement's where we keep the seriously restricted items, and the Australian National Library is the only place in Australia that can lawfully possess a copy of this banned material.
And the Parliamentary Library.
Two libraries. Well, we were taken down. I was taken down into the vault. They undid much combination locks and opened this rather heavy swing door. And we walked into the seriously restricted place. And there was this rather sad shelf of banned books.
Mainly pornography.
And then she pointed to the Peaceful Pill Handbook. She took it down and she said, we'd like you to sign it for us. So we did a book signing of one in the National Library, and they took photographs. I mean, they saw the ludicrous nature of using this whole concept of trying to use censorship as a way of dictating and controlling social practice. And I think it's curious, but I don't see any changing in that attitude being expressed. As soon as we hear figures published, and we've had some in the recent time about, for example, the recent publication of the large number, the highest rate of suicides that take place in Australia is amongst the elderly people. And there's shock around the nation. I say, oh my God, the highest rate of suicide is amongst the elderly. What are we going to do about this? But thinking more about that, many of those suicides are rational suicides that take place in the context of serious and terminal illness. If you're dying from your lung cancer and you battle that cancer, but at the last minute when it gets almost impossible, you decide to take the drug that you've wisely acquired and end your life peacefully, what goes on the statistics is not lung cancer, not goes on your death certificate is not cancer as the cause of death. What goes on your death certificate is suicide. And so that number gets larger and larger, and society, the commentators who were reporting on this, said this was an outrage. It's something that needed the direction of larger and larger amounts of funding to try and alleviate. And when I wrote an opinion piece it ran in the Sydney Morning Herald and said, actually, that's not true. Actually, these are suicide statistics that our society should be proud of. Because what it shows is that we're giving people choice and they're exercising that choice, not something you should be panicking over. It wasn't terribly well received, that line, but I still think it's not a bad one. And I actually find that this argument that we need to stop people making a rational choice at the end by any means we can is just plain ludicrous.
So would you give your mum the choice?
Well, of course, I get really quite challenged by my own mother because she fits entirely into that class. She's sitting languishing in a nursing home in Adelaide at the age of 94. Every time I go and see her, she says to me, I'm sick of this. Can't you help me get out of this? All of my friends have died. I don't like what I'm doing. I don't like being here. I would like to leave. Can't you help me? It puts me into a rather difficult position because I absolutely believe that she should have that option. It's a tricky one. You'd be perhaps aware that helping someone die attracts serious penalties, and I'm not in the slightest bit interested in spending any time in prison at all if I can avoid it. Nothing shuts you up quicker than a prison sentence. So I don't quite know how to deal with it, and she keeps going on about it, and I think she's quite genuine, although you're never quite sure. What I would like to see is I'd like her to have those drugs because then, in a sense, she could make her own decision. She's very sharp of mind. She knows exactly what she wants. Recently, when she was waiting for the general practitioner to arrive early in the morning, he got there a little bit earlier and said, "How are you, Mrs. Nitschke?" And she said, "Bloody awful, I wish I wasn't here." Next thing we know, she had a visit arranged by the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist questioned her, and I heard later he'd asked her, "Now, have you been talking to your son? And has he told you about ways you might end your life?" Everything was being moved in here to try and prevent this. And she said, "I can't take this step. With you involved, I've got to organise things myself." So I thought, in the last few weeks, I've had enough of this. I will call her bluff. So what I've done is I've enrolled her to go to Switzerland. She can go to Switzerland. If she can manage the flight to Zurich, she will be given the drugs, because the Swiss are the most enlightened of nations, which not only have legislation which allows a person to have this choice, but they keep it open for foreigners in a way that the Dutch or the States of America don't. In other words, the Swiss will allow Australians to go there. They will give you the drugs and they say, if you want to die, drink that. If you don't want to die, don't drink it. But it's there, and they make that option available. 20 Australians have made that trip, which I suppose is interesting because 200 people from the UK have made it, which just reflects the fact that if you're so sick that you want to die, travelling to Zurich is not an easy option. But I've made that arrangement. Now I think next time, and when I get back to Adelaide in a few days' time, I'll go and visit her again. I'll say next time she says, "Oh, it's bloody awful, I wish I wasn't here," I say, "Right, let's get that one-way ticket to Zurich started and we'll see what happens." And I think actually, like a lot of people, when they get access, they stop worrying. It takes away the trouble. What we see over and over, people get the drug, the best of the drugs is Nembutal. They get the drugs and they don't use it. They like the knowledge that they've got it. They wake up every morning, things are awful, the cancer's dreadful, but if they want to leave, they've simply got to pour it into a glass and drink it, and that gives them the courage. Not into the courage, it puts them back in control. And when you're back in control, that gives you the willingness often to carry on. And more often than not, these are the people that die of their own disease rather than access to these drugs. So I don't think it's a great threat enrolling my mother in this way. I think what it'll do is make her feel somewhat better.
But in a way, it's not just calling your mum's bluff, it's also bringing the issue into the heart of the Nitschke family and your siblings. because you don't get to Zurich unless you've got supportive statements of all the children.
Yeah, for those who are thinking that it's straightforward going to Zurich, it isn't entirely straightforward. It's there's quite a lot of requirements that are needed. You have to have letters from all siblings agreeing with the process, and that could be an issue in our family because not everyone thinks it's a hell of a good idea. So that might be an issue, and the Swiss will simply not allow a person to come there if they have not got letters from their children agreeing with their parents' decision, and also from partners, and copies of marriage certificates, and copies of divorce papers. Nothing like the Swiss when it comes to being absolutely fanatical about the formalities of the process, and never have I seen people have to gather so many bits of paper to make this journey. And I saw one dreadful situation develop in Darwin where this poor person who was having a dreadful death from bowel cancer would have satisfied any of the requirements for dignitas in Switzerland, but because he was born in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, we couldn't get an extract of his birth certificate. And on that basis, he couldn't go. He could have gone in every other way. So be aware of that if you're planning your trip to Zurich. I would suggest, rather than that, make a trip to Peru. If you've got that, if you're harbouring that desire to have a look at Machu Picchu before you die, take the opportunity now. And when you're just dabbling in Lima, just walk into the right shop and you can buy the best of the drugs over the counter, totally legally. And that can put you in a very good position at some later stage. Shelf life of about 25 years, so that covers most of us, I'm sure.
Now, I've got to warn you at this stage, Philip, that you keep talking about people going to Peru or Mexico and it keeps getting you into trouble. Some people may know that Philip did medicine quite late in life at 35, but he's managed in this short period of years to become the subject of 3 separate medical board investigations into his fit and proper personhood. Yes. And one of the reasons is because he dares to talk about what you can do. Do you want to say a few words about this last medical board investigation that's come about last week, and then we can maybe open the floor to questions?
Yeah, Fiona's quite right. There are 3 inquiries going on into whether I'm a fit and proper person. Look, it seems that the forces of darkness which are out there have been trying to effectively close down the movement towards either changing the laws and certainly opening up the access to people having this choice, have tried for quite a while to get criminal charges brought against me, and that hasn't been successful. Now they seem to have started a different tack, which is to try and get me deregistered. And that's a little bit easier because the criteria to be deregistered can be as loosely defined as not being a person of fit and proper character, whatever the hell that means. And it is getting a little bit annoying because I was recently, and by recently I mean about 3 months ago, invited to give a talk at a large teaching hospital in Perth. I was invited to deliver the morning talk on this issue of euthanasia, so I willingly went along, talked to medical and nursing staff, thought it was very successful, answered a lot of questions, left feeling pleased that it had been so well attended. And then 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the medical board saying that the head of the Department of Pain Management at the Charlie Gardner Hospital was so incensed by my talk that he's put in a formal complaint to the medical board about me being deregistered. So, I mean, this is bizarre. I mean, it's one thing if you're getting challenged because you're failing in some procedural matter when you're practicing medicine, but this was over the delivery of information, again, about what's actually happening. And again, it harks back to the idea of censorship. So I don't know how this is going to turn out. I've been a little taken aback by it and annoyed by it, the whole process, and I suppose in the end we'll find out whether one is a fit and proper character to continue or not. It wouldn't make a huge difference to my life if I was to lose registration, because what I do entirely now, as far as my work is concerned, and at Exit International, really doesn't fit into the criteria of practicing medicine. And I think that whole idea that people ending their lives should be taken away from the medical profession. There's such a lot of difficulty out there. Death is not a medical issue. Death is a natural process. We're all going to do it. You don't need a doctor. You're all going to die with or without a doctor standing at your side. And this medicalisation of the dying process causes many of the difficulties we see in this issue. And I think trying to push that idea that people want to have control of this with or without the support of the medical profession is a way forward. And I think the medical profession would appreciate it too, because many of them do not want to be sucked into this idea of being at that person's side and deliberately ending their life, and I can see what they mean. I sat with 4 people in the Northern Territory as they received lethal injections from a machine that I built, and it's not an easy path for anyone, and it's certainly not an easy path for a doctor. But it's a right to have that choice, which I would fight passionately for. So, questions, do you think?
Yeah, I'll just one last one, because I'm curious. The other week at TEDx at the Opera House, you had to your brief was to write your own eulogy. So, what did you say, or what would it say?
Oh, it's always a good exercise, isn't it? Write your own eulogy sort of thing, yeah. Oh, wow, I'm really looking forward to doing that, I thought, when they kind of, wow, my own eulogy. But I did. People think, what do you want? Plenty of people have done this little exercise and talked about what they want on their gravestone. And of course, I'm thinking of myself rotting away out in the Gibson Desert, so there won't be a gravestone. But still the idea of some reference to your life. And I think the thing that used to always, I thought, struck a chord of me at a very young age is a line that I got out of when I was reading Papillon about the person who was incarcerated on Devil's Island and all those attempts to escape. And I remember him reflecting when he was hurled back into prison after yet another failed attempt about the curse of a wasted life. And I thought, I do not want to think that one's life, my life, has gone by and I can look back and think that was time wasted. It doesn't matter how difficult, I don't want it to be wasted. So that would be my eulogy. This was not a wasted life, and I'd be really flattered if someone wrote that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, now I believe we have 2 roving mics. Just the one roving mic. You might have to wave your hands around a bit because of the light, it's quite hard to see. Okay, so we'll start up here and then centre at the back.
Is euthanasia legal in the Northern Territory?
What's the question?
Is euthanasia, I'll repeat it for those who didn't hear, is euthanasia legal, voluntary euthanasia legal in the Northern Territory?
It was briefly legal in 1996 to 1997 for 8 months. It was the world's first place where it was legal, but then it was overturned by federal parliament. Kevin Andrews, the politician who drove the overturning, is now a minister in the Tony Abbott government, but it was overturned, and Australia is back into the dark ages where no one can legally help you die.
Okay, the centre up the back, about 3rd row from the back. Then we'll come up here again.
Philip, it's good to hear from you. I thought this might be a useful forum to advise people. There is a candidate for the Voluntary Euthanasia Party in New South Wales elections next March. Shane Hickson is standing as a candidate for the Voluntary Euthanasia Party, so in the upper house. So people here will probably be interested in that, and perhaps that would assist
that's better.
getting some legislation on sometime.
Yeah, look, I think the Voluntary Euthanasia Party is an important initiative. It was started up last year, and I'm enthusiastically participating in it. And as mentioned by the questioner, there will be a candidate here. Well, actually, there'll be 15 candidates here standing in the upper house, and one of them is Shane Hickson. And we hope that strategy will, in effect, I think, encourage perhaps the New South Wales State Parliament to move on this issue. We're also standing candidates in Victoria. Their election comes up in November of this year. So the political process goes on, and sooner or later there is an inevitability. Laws will change. I thought they'd change a decade ago, and they haven't yet, but they will change. But I'm not sure that even that will get around what I see as this growing swell of people that are saying to me, laws or no laws, I want the choice and I make the decision myself. So I think we can work both ways. I support the idea, and I work quite hard with the idea of changing laws, but I also recognise that many people want far more than that.
I mean, you just came quite close to being elected as a Western Australian senator.
Yes. I stood in West Australia when they had the rerun there, and if it wasn't for the Liberal Democrats, we would have made it almost. We beat the Sex Party, the WikiLeaks Party, we beat the...
But then what?
Huh?
Is that how you want to spend the next 6 years?
Yes, well, that's right. That's where I would have had to spend my next 6 years in...
So will you be standing in New South Wales?
No. Shane Hickson's standing in New South Wales, and I'm not standing in Victoria either.
Right.
Anyway.
Okay, the lady in the green.
Thank you. Do I need to stand up? No.
No.
I wonder if the cost of keeping people alive in those last months and years of life will eventually drive a change in this.
I think it will. Did everyone hear that question? In what role does the financial aspect of this issue play a part in determining social policy? And I think it will become quite important. I mean, we're already being told that we're in crisis financially. The country needs all of these cuts to changes to try and bring us back out of our bleak financial situation. But it's bleedingly obvious that the last few months of life are where the vast majority of health funds are spent, keeping people. And many people don't want it spent on them. So at least the argument goes, allow those people who don't want that money spent on them to have this choice. And that, of course, means changing the laws or at least allowing them to take that option. Because it seems bizarre that we're keeping people alive who don't want to be kept alive and in the process are almost driving our own society into bankruptcy by doing it. So I hope that people say, oh, no, we don't want to talk about this issue of finances, but we must talk about it. And as I said, many people come along and say that to me. They'll just say it in those terms. They say, I'm being kept alive by all of this expensive treatment. I want to leave some money to I've heard this one not too long ago. I want to leave some money, bequest some money to my daughter. And it's being all spent. My money's being spent on keeping me alive and I don't want to be alive. Now, when her daughter heard of that, she was mortified. But the mother said, look, that's my decision. I don't want to leave nothing to my daughter. I'm just wasting money. And it's seen in those terms by many people, but again, it's going to require some politicians with courage to allow that change to take place.
Okay, this lady in the pink.
Okay, I'm just looking at the issue of rights to life with abortion, where we have this controlling from outside of women's bodies.
Yes.
And so we have these two parallel ones with the rights to life of children and at the other end. So I'm just wondering if your struggles are similar to those who struggle for women to have rights in terms of abortion.
Yeah, look, it's very interesting to notice that many of the women that are fighting hardest on this issue now of right to peaceful death at the time of their choosing are often women who played the same sort of role in trying to challenge legislation that restricted a woman's right and access to abortion at an earlier age when reproductive rights were the issue. Now, of course, it's rights at the end of life. And there are so many parallels between the two issues because the people who are often our opponents we find are exactly the same. Predominantly, we're looking at the church. They're the ones that wield the influence within the parliamentary process. They're the ones that aren't allowing people to effectively not only control their bodies through the abortion issue, but also through the issue at the end of life.
And groups like the Australian Christian Lobby.
Yeah, groups like the Australian Christian Lobby who wield such influence as politicians, by and large, are quite fearful of attracting the epithet of being anti-church. It seems like it's a kiss of death for a politician to attract that.
So to speak.
Kiss of death, so to speak, yeah. So this, I mean, the idea, this idea about challenging a person's right to control their bodies in this way is there's so many similarities, and the people are the same. So I guess we'll see those changes take place sooner or later. But we've been really taken aback. Sometimes I say to people, it's been nearly 20 years I've been working on this, and we're getting nowhere. And they said, that's nothing. I remember when we were trying to change abortion laws and went on for 35 years. So, I mean, there is this idea that major social changes like this do lead to quite slow and protracted process. The other thing I'd say about the issue is that there's quite a fear that spread through the opponents to voluntary euthanasia when it became clearer that more and more people are accessing lethal drugs. Because when you've got your own drugs, you don't really care whether the law changes or not. You've got that option irrespective of legislation. And of course, that was the same fear that went through society when RU 486 was developed. And it looked for a while, it never turned out quite like that, but it looked for a while like the development of this technological solution, if you like, so that a woman could control her own pregnancy by using a drug like that might effectively mean that the doctors were moved out of the process, and so the control of the process was lost, and the church panicked. Didn't turn out to be quite as serious as they had first thought, but the same panic we see now when people are found to have more and more. And I suspect this big police crackdown, which is going on around the nation now, is probably driven by people from within the conservative religious groups of the nation.
Heard it here first.
Yes.
Lady in the front row.
Your website has been censored.
Yes.
Could you talk about that and also what information is available worldwide in various languages?
The book's censored, not the website. At this point.
The internet's been regarding censorship. The internet has been such an amazing development. It's changed everything, and of course now the information is out there and almost very hard to rein in. They put a ban on the printed word, but of course the book is published online, and anyone can go to peacefulpill.com and get all of that information. And there's been attempts to try and change that. You may recall last year, the year before last year, there was an attempt to bring in a internet censoring, the mandatory filtering that was about to be imposed, so that people, ostensibly to try and control people's access to child pornography on the internet. That's what the public message was, that we might have to have national censorship of the internet for that. But when WikiLeaks published the list of the 1,000 websites that the federal government were looking at censoring, they weren't all pornography. Our website, peacefulpill.com and exitinternational.com...
And several YouTube videos.
Yeah, were mixed up in, WikiLeaks showed, in the group of websites that were planned to be censored if the federal government had got its way. In fact, there was an opinion piece published in the Sydney Morning Herald by Michael Duffy, which said he asked a rhetorical question when he was talking about this proposed censorship of the internet. He said, I'll ask people, what do the following three websites have in common? There's pantyass.com, peacefulpill.com, and pickyourperversion.com. And what they were, of course, were the P listings in that list of 1,000 that WikiLeaks had released. And so the federal government were lying. I guess they're good at it. They were lying about what their plan was. Their plan wasn't just to eradicate access to child pornography. Mixed up in it were a lot of other social issues which they had no wish to see allowed to have that information portrayed. So the information's still out there, and it's good. It's good information.
Okay, the lady here in the red.
Philip, I wonder if you could speak a little more about organised religious groups within the medical profession who lobby against voluntary euthanasia. I'm thinking particularly of a group called Doctors for the Family, and these are groups that don't necessarily reveal that they're connected with the Catholic Church, or that the doctors within them think they have a holy mission to represent God in their profession rather than their patients.
Yes, of course. I mean, these groups are certainly out there, and they're quite powerful in their ability to lobby within the structures of the medical profession, in much the same way as we see the lobbying that goes on within federal parliament there of politicians. So, look, these groups exist. We find ourselves constantly having to debate with them. We find their influence affecting not only the Australian Medical Association, which of course many say that unless the AMA comes on site, we'll never see legislation in this country on voluntary euthanasia. We've often said, look, all we want from the AMA is to take a neutral position on euthanasia. They've taken a neutral position on abortion. They have no position on abortion, the Australian Medical Association, yet they are hostile towards the issue of allowing access to legislation for voluntary euthanasia, driven, I would say, by the very same influential lobby groups which make it quite clear that behind their driving motivation is their own spiritual beliefs. So exposing them, I suppose, is what we try to do, but hopefully, I don't know, common sense will prevail, but it's taking an awful long time.
But you do find you're currently on a speaking tour almost of medical students, conferences, and you do find a very warm welcome from the medical students as opposed to fully trained doctors, don't you? There's quite a difference there.
Yes, I am actually speaking to large groups of medical students. In the next few weeks, I've been speaking to them. It's quite interesting because the talk I'm giving to these groups of medical students, the National Annual Medical Students grouping this year, is exactly the same talk that I gave to the Charlie Gardner Hospital, which was deemed to be delivered in a way that should have me sanctioned as being not a fit and proper person. What I find with the medical school groupings is a much more of an openness and a willingness to engage with this issue. So, I mean, things are changing. When we first got involved in this issue, 70% of the public thought it was a good idea, but it was only less than 50% of doctors. That support within the medical profession has grown, And I suppose that is encouraging. And the idea that the AMA will come on side and will get legislation is encouraging. But back of my mind is this feeling, nevertheless, that I'm worried about the fact that I do not want to see the issue become one that is ultimately medicalised and then controlled by the medical profession. Death is not something that should be controlled by the profession. I urge people, do not abdicate your responsibility and your ability to control your own lives to some other force, be it another panel of doctors. Keep it yourself.
Okay, we've got time for a few more. Gentlemen here.
I'm a member of Exit International. I thank you for your work, for your initiatives. On the point of prolonging life, my local pharmacist, who makes up packs of medications for patients to have on a weekly basis, describes that part of his job as keeping people not dead rather than prolonging life, because many of them are in a near vegetative state. Yes. My question, although I take your point about the AMA and the medical establishment, I wondered whether Exit could initiate a questionnaire that we as patients could take to our GPs and actually ask their views. We don't necessarily have the terms that would be applicable, but if we were informed as to the kinds of questions, ethical and medical, that we could present when we see our GPs on a regular basis, and we all do, sadly, even though, as I accept what you say about not medicalising euthanasia, at least there could become a reaction, a response from people like the Doctors Reform Society members and others.
Yes, of course.
That might start a groundswell, that then could continue when new students were new qualified students joined the force.
I think it's a fair enough idea. The idea of, and I think it's important for everyone to know what their doctor's views are on this very issue. And it can be a difficult question to ask, and sometimes it's hard to interpret the answers if you talk about it in a tangential way. So the idea of having something where you could actually provide in written form to get an idea of what your doctor's thoughts are on, it might not be as easy as it sounds. I mean, we battle to get the views of many politicians on this issue. We will go and sit there and ask them, and you often simply cannot get an answer from them. And of course the reason there is that they fear that once they start admitting to what their views are, that it might be used against them at some later stage. And I suppose we might find the same issue with doctors, although I doubt we would see quite the same degree. So yeah, it's not a bad thought. It is nice to know that the person that you are ultimately getting to provide you with your primary medical care, your GP, is someone who at least accepts that at some point in time you might be the one who wants to make that decision about your own life. It's a comforting feeling.
Okay, I think we've got time for just two more questions. So one over here and then one over there.
Just your view on physically well people, particularly young people, wanting to exercise their right to die.
Well, people have often, as my views have changed quite significantly over the 20 years I've been involved. I started off believing that the only people who should have access to help to die were those who were determined by legislative guidelines. And of course, in the Northern Territory law, you had to be physically very sick. In fact, you had to be just about dead to qualify to be able to use that Northern Territory law. And over the years, I started to meet people who had other reasons who would never have qualified to use those criteria, and they wanted to die. And they'd come and talk to me, and I was challenged by some of them. The person who most challenged me was Lisette Nigo, who came along and said to me in Perth, "I'm going to die in 4 years' time." And I said, "What's the disease?" And she said, "I haven't got a disease. I'm 76 and 80's the time to die." And I thought, oh, that's a bit silly. I don't believe her. Every time I went back to Perth, she was there. I'd have a cup of coffee. It was going to be 3 years, and then it was 2 years, and I thought, this woman is serious. And I said, for goodness sake, Lisette, you're not sick. Write a book. She was a retired academic from the University of Western Australia. Write a book. Go on a world cruise. And she said, mind your own business. She said, what's it to you? She said, all as I want from you is technical information about drugs. I make the decision about when I live and die, not you. Don't come along here and subject my views to your little template and decide whether I satisfy your criteria. If the information is going to be delivered with a sermon, she said, forget it. So I was totally mortified by being described in that way as delivering a sermon, and I thought about it and worried an awful lot. And in the end, I thought, for goodness sake, she has every right. She went on to say, look, you went off and studied physics and studied medicine. I studied something quite different. You've got information and skills that I want. What gives you the right to hold that information to yourself and dole it out to people that satisfy your criteria? And that's true. So I thought, she said, it could have been the other way around. You could have been sitting at my feet wanting that information. And so I gave her the information, and once with the information, she took it. She got the drug. She ended her life when she was 80. Everyone, it got a lot of publicity across Australia. John Howard said he was mortified.
Appalled.
Appalled.
He was appalled.
I'm appalled that we're helping well people to die. This is the slippery slope now. You're starting to talk about not sick people, well people, and there's been lots of others.
But the question was about young, well people.
I'm getting to them. Iris Flounders, 60 years with Don dying of cancer. She says, I'm going to die at the same time. I don't want to live without Don. She would never have been accepted to be helped by legislation. Don would have been helped. He was dying of mesothelioma. But Iris, his wife of 40 years, said, we couldn't have helped her. We would have said, go home and come back when you're sick. But she said, I want to die at the same time. And so my views then started changing. I thought, well, every person of sound mind, adult, we're not talking about children, we're not talking about people afflicted by psychiatric malady, we're talking about well people, adults. They understand the permanence of death. And almost immediately I was challenged in the memorable interview of the National Review in the US, a conservative magazine in the United States said, so you would help an 18-year-old. They're an adult, they're of sound mind. Would you give them that information?
The troubled teen, isn't it?
The troubled teen, as they said. And I said, well, we're quite happy to give troubled teens guns and send them over to Afghanistan and expect them to kill over there. And at the same time we say, oh, hell no, we can't give them information about drugs that might end their life. And there seems to me to be a disjoint here, and I wasn't happy with it, so I said, yeah. And I've been trying to live that down ever since. So in our own workshops, we're running one on Saturday in Sydney. It's going to be tomorrow. It's going to be a very big one. There'll be a lot of people there, but there won't be many teenagers. We've imposed a restriction of 50. People said, why did you bring up the age of 50 as the criteria? Why not 49? Why not 52? It's impossible. No matter what age you pick, people will argue at the edges. And what we've ended up saying, look, 50 means you've had significant life experience, whatever that means. But my own deep philosophical view is that people of sound mind should have this option. And then I suppose that takes me back that, yes, they should have the information. That doesn't mean I'd go out there and give them drugs, but I don't have to. I would make sure they had access to information so they can choose to take it if they want to or not take it if they don't. Trying to keep a society safe by restricting the flow of information, I think, is doomed to fail as much as this war against drugs is.
Okay, final question somewhere over here. Yep.
I'm in a position that I support families following a suicide death, both peaceful and traumatic. Yes. The grief issues that actually come out following that death with families are very different. And I just wondered everything that I've sort of seen from Exit focuses on the advocacy of someone having this choice, but I haven't seen much about supporting the families, whether they support it or not, to understand their loved one's choice.
It is true. It is true that our focus has definitely been on the individual taking that course. It hasn't been, we haven't directed near as much time, I suspect, to the issues of what's left behind when a person takes this course, other than making mention of it when people start to talk in this way. Now, sometimes that's a little easier to understand than others. It's not unusual for people to come to me and say, I want to take this step and end my life. I'm not going to tell my children. They wouldn't understand. And I say to them, but do you really want to leave them behind having never had the opportunity to see what you were planning? And they say, but they would do everything they could to stop me, and I don't want to have yet another battle. I've got enough battles on my hands without having to battle with all these people telling me to keep on fighting against the disease or whatever else it is. So I think that idea, I sympathise with that view, and I said, well, if you don't want to tell them, I'm not going to tell them. Ultimately, I think you have a responsibility, but you ultimately are nevertheless the person who makes these decisions, and I think that does leave us vulnerable to that criticism, that we haven't spent as much time as we should of at least drawing attention to sometimes the carnage that is left behind. I mean, it's no surprise that Dignitas in Switzerland want letters of support from every child because they do not want what they see as the possibility of a very messy legislative legal challenge launched by some family member who feels that they weren't properly acquainted with the issue of a parent taking this step of ending their lives. So that's not a very satisfactory answer. I accept the fact that we have got a long way to go.
You have just employed Johannes in this area.
We have employed Johannes in Melbourne to start taking some significant, to have a better look at this very issue, because it's an issue which has not attracted the attention it should. I mean, we've been focused, I suppose, really on the very practical issue of how the hell do we get enough of these reliable and effective drugs into the hands of the people who want them, and that's actually turning out to be very difficult indeed.
Short of government funding.
Short of government funding, and we're attracting no government funding at all.
Okay, before we go, book signing apparently is going to happen downstairs immediately after, so Philip does encourage you to support him and show Melbourne University Press, who took on what some people would say was an unpopular topic and an unpopular person. So we'd like to prove the critics wrong. But thank you for coming, and thank you, Philip. Give your voice a rest.
Thank you.